Colin, I've just muted you because there's a little bit of background noise. Okay. And we are live, everybody. Hi. We're joined by, this is episode 5 of the Fair Go Basic Income Discussion Group, where we talk about all things relevant to basic income in Australia. We are now joined by Tim Hollow of the Green Institute, who is responsible for some polling that came out towards the end of last year. Tim, why don't you just start by giving us a brief overview of the polling and what you found?
Sure thing. Well, I thought on discussion with Josh that I'd give you a bit of kind of context to it and talk about the sort of the political context that, as I see, we find ourselves in at the moment, and then move into to that polling from kind of how it came to be. Because there's not a hell of a lot of detail to the poll. It was just a couple of questions, but we'll get to that in a minute, and then plenty of time for conversation, if that's okay.
Sure. What I'll do is I'll get people to, everyone you'll see under more on your computers, you should have the option to raise your hand. So as you're going, if you think you have a question for Tim, raise your hand. And when we've got a few questions, I might interrupt Tim and we'll get to them in a batch or something, if that's okay. So dive in, Tim, and tell us about what's the context around this polling.
Good stuff. Well, look, I'll start also just by acknowledging, of course, that we're meeting on stolen land. I'm joining from the land of the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and still to come. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, something so vital for us to acknowledge all the time, but of course that much more so on the eve of Invasion Day. And as I've learned from some wonderful elders that I've had the opportunity to yarn with over recent years, this always will be Aboriginal land because it's not actually, in fact, possible for them to cede sovereignty. In Indigenous culture, country owns us, not the other way around. You cannot cede ownership of something which actually you are part of. And I say that because it's just so critical that our culture, which obsesses over owning and enclosing and extracting value from land, grapples with that idea. And it's that idea, enclosure, ownership, not just of land and of the air that we breathe and the water we drink, but of us, of our bodies, of our minds, of our labour, which has gotten us into this mess. And that's really what led me to my fascination for the idea of UBI. When our capacity to survive is entangled with our capacity to sell our labour, we are ourselves enclosed and commodified, turned into a resource from which to extract value. And UBI, by disentangling paid labour from the capacity to survive, liberates us from that commodification. And in that way, it's an extraordinary, revolutionary shift, which is kind of why I think, despite being an idea with such a long and proud pedigree, that it's always struggled to be taken seriously in mainstream politics. Now, in order to get a major reform like UBI implemented, you need two interrelated shifts, in my view, political strategy. You need to shift the political discourse, the common sense, the mythology in favour of the reform, and you need to build the political power behind it, the constituencies demanding change. And here in Australia right now, it's fair to say UBI is a very, very long way outside the mainstream political discourse, and there is no real substantial constituency demanding it. As I was actually told once when asking for directions in France as this happened, you wouldn't want to start from here. But as we'll come to, given all this, there's actually extraordinary public support that we've found in our poll. But before we talk about that, I thought it would be really important to have a look at this not at all ideal place that we're starting from over a few minutes. So our political discourse on this front, where's it at? It's dominated by two very powerful mythologies. On the right, we've got the idea of lifters versus leaners, the stigmatization of the poor and the unemployed. And on the left, we've got the idea of the dignity of work, the fetishization of paid labour over all other modes of participation and contribution. And squeezed out of this battle of the stories, we've got the values of universalism and unconditional support for all members of our society, the dignity of every human being, the values that underpin UBI. Now, why are these getting squeezed out? Because our capitalist economic system requires an endless supply of cheap, obedient labour. And the best way to achieve that is to make being unemployed intolerable, to subject those without work to humiliation, to surveillance, to abject poverty, not just to make life impossible for them, but as a stark warning to everybody else. As I see it, it's the domestic equivalent of our offshore detention torture camps for refugees. Don't even think about it, is the message. And it's supported, like our refugee policy, by both our major parties and by most of our civil society. The coalition, Liberal National Coalition, to the best of my knowledge, have completely ignored the idea of UBI up to date. I've searched for any reference to it from the PM, the Treasurer, the Human Services Minister, anyone really, and I've come up with nothing. But we know what they think. The idea of an unconditional payment to all people, regardless of unemployment status, it's so far outside their worldview that it's unimaginable. There are a handful of libertarians in the Senate who might consider it on the grounds of small government. But firstly, it wouldn't fly with the ideological stigmatisation of the unemployed that the bulk of their both parties subscribe to. And secondly, importantly, that's not, I think, the kind of devil's bargain that I think any of us would want to make. The last thing that we want, I hope, is a UBI designed by libertarians, cutting other benefits, undermining universal healthcare, education, etc. Please, let's not play with that fire. On the other side, there are a bunch of Labor people who've spoken about UBI, but almost all of them have rejected it out of hand on the basis that it's giving up on work. And I've heard those words specifically many times, giving up on work. Labor values have shifted over the last century or so dramatically from the dignity of the working person and the need to liberate them from the bonds of the bosses to the dignity of work itself. It's this full-on embrace of the Protestant work ethic. If you don't work, you don't have value. This makes them incredibly skeptical of the idea of any welfare-related policy that doesn't incentivize people to work. There are some wonderful exceptions to this, which I'm really delighted to see, but they're few and far between. There's also in Labor an embrace of the neoliberal principle that targeted support is better than universalism. And I think that's partly due to a fear of the politics of making the tax system more progressive. Chris Bowen and Andrew Leigh in particular both attack UBI and laud the current targeted system based on getting, and I quote from Bowen, greater bang for our poverty alleviation buck from targeted welfare. An argument from neoliberal austerity politics, which I think is losing support, actually, both broadly in the community and even within the Labor Party. But at this point, here's the point, neither major party is willing to talk in terms of universalism, is willing to talk about unconditional support for everybody. And the same goes for the bulk of civil society. Business community, of course, falls strongly behind the lifters and leaners mythology. The Labor movement, deeply committed to the idea of the dignity of work, with a handful of exceptions. In many ways, and very sadly to me as a long-standing union member and supporter, the Labor movement is currently actually the biggest barrier to UBI in Australia, I think. If we're to get anywhere, we need to shift their trenchant opposition. And part of that, I think, is reminding them of the proud history of the movement being about helping people to work less, for their labour to have less power over their lives, starting with the 8-hour day, the weekend, sick leave. That's a vital project. And I think we also have to reassure the union movement that we'll continue to fight with them to maintain and improve labour conditions, which they, I think, legitimately fear a UBI could undermine. And we also need to talk to them about universalism, which leads us to the poll. The social services groups I want to talk about briefly also accord with the Labor movement on the dignity of work largely, but they also bring in this interesting, slightly more nuanced, but I also think wrong idea that paid labour is the only way for people to find agency in their lives. And that might be the case in our impoverished world right now, but it needn't be if we build deeper democracy, community cohesion. But that's a whole other discussion for another time. I think the main fear for many of them actually is of losing the broader social compact, universal health and education, support for housing, etc., which are so hard won. And I think there's actually a softening I perceive in the opposition to UBI among these groups, partly on the basis that that social compact has already been so deeply undermined that we need to change gears. I think we should also give some thought to working with faith groups and feminist groups, both of whom have very deep commitments to the value of universalism. And it's that value of universalism that I think is vital that we build on in seeking to build support in both the labour movement and the social services movement as well, and the community at large. Both the labour movement and the social services movement, who are powerful civil society movements, grew from a place of universalism, but have in this neoliberal age been pulled bit by bit towards the targeted individualistic approach. And that's an approach which is central to the political discourse, and it's been adopted by the main organised constituency groups. But it's never been popular, never. Most people believe in universalism. Most people love universal healthcare, universal public education. Why not universal basic income? Which brings us to this poll. If we're to shift the political discourse and build the political power towards UBI, we need to put a marker in the sand. We need to test the waters on those big mythological ideas and demonstrate to the gatekeepers of political power where people in the community actually stand. And so that's why I thought it was really important to do a poll testing basic levels of support for UBI and for unconditionality of income support payments. Over time, I think it's really vital that we start testing the full range of ideas, but polling not being terribly cheap for a smell of an oily rag set up like the Green Institute, we chose to keep this one simple.
Before we get into the actual polling, there was
Sure.
so much great material there. Let's just take 5 minutes. I'm sure that no one's got their hand up, but I'm sure people have questions. I know I do. I wanted to sort of circle back about a few things. I really feel like there's a huge wealth to be teased out in this comparison between indigenous societies and late stage capitalism. One of the thinkers is an American philosopher called Carl Wiederquist, who I'm not sure if you're aware of his work, but I think his next book is called The Prehistory of Private Property.
Nice.
And it basically sets out this this fascinating narrative which starts with the Enclosures Acts, as you say, in they were literally called the Enclosures Acts. Yep. in Great Britain and northwestern Europe, and how what had been the common land to which everybody had access was suddenly enclosed. And so what this was an expansion of the property system to cover things which had not been necessarily property until a few hundred years ago. Yeah. And then that system sort of exploded out of Europe and took over the world, and is presented as this natural sort of organic thing that just comes down from heaven, as if people had nothing to do with it and it can't be questioned or changed. But when you look at the confrontation of the British Empire and the First Nations, you can see quite clearly there were two different systems, and one was imposed using violence over the other. And the sort of, to quote Monty Python, it's an example of where the violence inherent in the system
totally,
becomes visible. Not to try and compare, do this. I'm not trying to say that Indigenous people haven't had a unique experience of suffering and dispossession, but that the engine of that suffering and dispossession is something that we can examine on this more ideological level. And when you do, you say, it's like, well, okay, we've all had we can't go into nature and take our sustenance directly from it. The property system imposes on us. Everything's either a national park or it's some farmer's land, right? And there's nowhere where there is wilderness that obviously I wouldn't have the skill set, but presumably there are people who could go out and build a cabin and fish from the river but they're not allowed to do that. Indigenous people aren't allowed to return to their pre-settlement way of life. So, people always say you act like society owes you a living. Well, I kind of think it does, because it's denied us one. So there's this wonderful
mid-20th century Danish agricultural economist, actually, Esther Boserup, who's quoted, in a bunch of really interesting books on that kind of idea of this this history of property. And it's fascinating that Carl's doing a book on that. There's a couple of really great ones. The History of the World in Seven Chief Things by Raj Patel is a wonderful one to look at, and a bunch of others. Against the Grain. But Boserup says that the best way to keep people subservient is to prevent them from being independent cultivators. that is absolutely the core of the point. It's the core of the domination. It's the core of the enclosures. It's the core of capitalism. It's the core of imperialism, patriarchy, colonialism. And yeah, that I think, yeah, you're dead right. And that narrative as well is something that's going into the book that I'm in the process of finishing as well, about ecological politics. So yeah, I'm glad you teased that out.
Yeah, that's something I'm hoping that we'll actually get Carl Widerquist on to speak about it at some stage, but the time zones make it very difficult.
Yeah.
But he may be another guest, and hopefully we might get you on as well to bring some of the Australian experience into that discussion. Now, I've got a couple of questions that are people coming into people are putting their questions in the chat. I'm going to ask them again. Raise your hand if you want to ask it, and I'll actually get you on video asking it of Tim, so that we may end up posting that as a clip or something. So we want to hear and see you rather than have the questions in the chat, if that's possible. So George has his hand up. I'm going to come to him now, and then I'm going to come back. We're going to get back onto where the political parties stand. But let's quickly just get George, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. Thanks, guys. Hope you can hear me all right. Not too much echo. So I was wondering, with the polling, well, there's things like GetUp and SurveyMonkey, which are well used for various causes. What's the pros and cons of using those avenues, and which one did you use for this survey?
So it really depends on what you're trying to get out of the survey, and I can talk about the way we did that shortly if you like. I think GetUp and SurveyMonkey and things like that are fantastic for getting responses from a constituency. So talking to a self-selecting group of people and asking what their opinions are, which is very, very valuable in all sorts of things. It's really important for GetUp, for instance, to survey their members on what they think and what they want. And SurveyMonkey is a great tool for any organisation to do that kind of thing. What we did was a public poll through a public polling company. We used YouGov to get a statistical representation of what Australia at large believes. And we did that because we wanted to kind of put that marker in the sand and say, okay, so here's what a statistically valid sample of the Australian population thinks about this issue. If you're using a kind of a targeted thing like SurveyMonkey or a Facebook poll or GetUp's polling, it is only useful to kind of tell you what those people think. It's not going to be a statistically valid representation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was fine. So that leads me to my second question about whether it was a self-selecting audience, but you've answered that.
Yeah, no, this was a public poll, demographically distributed and all of that to get a statistically representative sample.
Cool.
Let's get into the results and the polling and the question and the sort of the process of formulating it a bit more. Jane in the comments is saying we have to get out of this work is good for people argument, and this is, I think, relates to a lot of what you were saying, that there's this overwhelming ideological consensus, at least amongst the sort of the professional sort of thought-making classes, that there's the value of work. And you mentioned, the sort of flavors of that, the conservative and more progressive flavors of this dignity of work argument, lifters and leaners. And you just went through what the major parties are doing. But I would like to circle back and say, put a little bit more pressure on you regarding what exactly is the Greens' position, because one thing that didn't get mentioned is a jobs guarantee. But that's something we've seen, and which to me, the jobs guarantee is the ultimate version of this dignity of work thing. We're getting a bunch of people with Russian names trying to join the chat. We'll see how that goes. This may be having the link in public isn't always the best thing. Anyhow, we'll manage that separately. But what's the Greens' position? I mean, I want to say something quickly about the jobs guarantee. I like to call it the pity fuck of the labour market, right? Because I also like, there's a movie called what was it called? True Romance, which was a 90s flick about this guy, and he's a bit of a loser, and he goes to a movie and he meets this girl at the movie, and she really likes him. And it turns out she's been hired, she's a call girl, and she's been hired by his friends to go and have this chance encounter with him to make him feel like he's really succeeded in, you know, the game of attracting sex. And this, to me, when people want to have it both ways, when they talk about the jobs guarantee, they talk about the dignity of sort of and earning your spot and striving and all of that stuff. But if we're guaranteeing jobs for people, it's sort of the worst of both worlds, right? We've sort of saying there's this dignity of work and this dignity of being productive, but it's all a little bit fake, and it's kind of made up. And so, why the Greens pushing a you know, they came out, you know, the leader was on TV talking about the jobs guarantee, not a UBI. What do you think is the ideological driver there?
So the Greens' position is in flux. Let me put it that way. And what's to put it very clearly, what Adam Bandt announced was not a jobs guarantee of the type that is being presented. It was a guaranteed opportunity to work kind of thing if you want it. I think the critical line in the sand for me and for a whole lot of others in this is the idea of making a jobs guarantee a compulsory thing, essentially a workfare kind of approach, which a number of the major international advocates of job guarantee are very, very firmly behind this idea that you have to work, otherwise you don't get any support, and you know that it's a mandatory process. That's something that I would very, very much fight extremely hard against. The Greens are not proposing any such thing. The Greens are proposing a program where minimum wage jobs are made available to those who want them, but also a living wage alongside it. So it's
the living wage and the minimum wage, are we saying that they're equivalent, or are we, what's the wage that's being offered?
I don't think there are exact numbers on that yet of what the party is likely to take to the election, but the understanding is that the living wage would be lower than the minimum wage. Not massively, but it would be somewhere between the poverty line and the jobs guarantee level. That's kind of where most people would be pitching it. So it's obviously above where... Oopsie.
Sorry, there's one of those random entrants that I thought was real, but it's probably not. We haven't had this issue before. Continue. We'll manage that. Yeah.
Yeah. So. Yeah, definitely.
Sorry.
Russian.
Yeah.
Okay. I wonder what they're interested in. So
well, we're getting. Sorry, but just to reframe it, are we hearing something here that's not been announced by the Greens? Are we getting this news? Are we breaking the story here on Fair Go discussion group about what the Greens policy is going to be? Stephen, I see your hand up, and I am going to get to you, by the way.
We're not breaking any news on this. The Greens put out in the about, I don't know, 6-8 months ago now, a kind of a pandemic recovery package, which is what included the jobs kind of package, but also an industrial policy to create jobs. So this is creating real jobs, not make work jobs, but also unconditional living wage kind of approach. So that's out there, but the policy still is being finessed and in flux. And I guess the point is, in answer to your initial question there, Austin, where do the Greens stand? The Greens are at this point very much in flux on these questions. And I, from a Green Institute perspective, am working very hard to kind of push in the direction of UBI. There's a lot of people in the party who very strongly support UBI. I think the party is much more firmly committed to the idea of universalism than either of the major parties, but it's very deeply embedded in that idea of universalism and much less attracted to this idea of targeting. The party is very fundamentally at a principles level committed to unconditionality of welfare. Very, very, very strongly, firmly committed to that. That's something that Rachel Siewert has spent much of her career in the Senate working extremely hard for. So on that level, kind of most of the way there, but there's still kind of there's still discussion to be had, because there's still certainly, you know, there's a wing of the Australian Greens which is much more kind of state socialist wing, which is kind of more committed to that, you know, the jobs creation approach, rather than the unconditional.
I think that's an interesting ideological difference. I would think that's quite important, and it sort of ties in with why maybe the labor movement's not on board. There's the labor movement approach, which is very much about social groups and about the landscape of social struggle,
right.
And sort of and the idea of, you know, the idea of class struggle and the idea of workers as the defining protagonist,
right,
of history. And then there's actually an idea which in some senses is more liberal and centrist, of the citizen as the protagonist. But that can also be, you can do really radical things with that because it allows for a universal approach. We're gonna go in a second to these questions. I just had an interesting example of what of the difference, that ideological difference that I've come across recently. It was in America, but it was a woman. She's a nurse in an intensive care unit or something. She's, you know, frontline health worker during the pandemic. And then it turned out she had an OnlyFans where she's, you know, doing sex work, internet sex work, as well as her job at the hospital. And all of the good lefties jumped to her defense and said, you know, nurses don't get paid enough, and, you know, she's struggling and she should be allowed to make a bit of money on the side. And it's like, well, so that's the sort of labor. That's when you're coming at the problem from that traditional labor movement point of view of her position in society, and her sort of victimhood as a worker is important. But there's another point of view, which is like, it doesn't matter. She could be as rich as anybody, and she'd still have the right to, to perform this work if it's legal work. She's got the right to do it, and no one should be interfering with her private life. So I think it was an interesting distinction between the sort of liberal and laborist, the liberal view of the citizen with universal rights versus the labor movement view of these big groups of society struggling with each other. And I'm not saying one view we should abandon one view and only use the other, but I think it's interesting to keep them both in perspective.
There's also just very briefly, kind of, as well as the liberal idea of the citizen and the rights of the individual, there's also, and I think this is quite strong in the Greens, and certainly this is where I would identify myself, is the much more anarchist approach to it, where state socialism, you know, basically is a much more paternalistic approach, basically, and controlling. Frankly, it says you must do this if you are to get. You have to do X if you're to get Y. The anarchist approach is, well, people should just be enabled and supported to choose their own path together, as long as you do it in a constructive and cooperative manner. So yeah, there's definitely that theme in Greens political theory as well. Okay,
we're going to go to Stephen, then Jane, and then I'll get those two questions, and I'll get you to answer them both, if that's all right, because we've now got 4 people with their hands up, and we want to get onto the material as well. So Stephen, please go ahead.
So who does support a UBI in Australia, and where would the potential support come from, do you think?
Do you want me to hold and answer that?
Yes. Jane, would you go ahead, please?
Hang on.
You were unmuted before. You just remuted yourself. Okay, go now, Jane.
Sorry. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm seeing you too.
And see you.
This may be more of a comment than a question, and I feel like a broken record, but we are broken records, all of us. We keep repeating the same arguments with the same blocks. We have to think differently about work. This is not whether or not people should have to work. It's what the bloody work is. Who owns the work? To what purpose is it being done? And one of the great benefits of basic income is that it enables us to put that question right out there, and some new kinds of approaches to work could be promoted through the availability of basic income funds. Along with that goes the point that we need to stop seeing this as an advantage for an individual. It's the aggregate income effect of basic income that is the real impact. What happens when a community has basic income, a small town has basic income, a down at heel neighborhood has basic income? It's this kind of, the whole is so much more than the sum of the parts, if you think socially and think in an aggregate way, and train the opposition to think that way. Okay, sermon over. Thank you.
Tim, go ahead, please. Let's respond to Stephen and then Jane.
Yeah, couldn't agree. Well, let me respond briefly to Jane first. Couldn't agree more. Obviously, as you know, Jane, we've had this conversation. I didn't put it into this brief stuff, but I'm putting it into more of what I'm saying. I guess in terms of the first point, this is why I talk very much in terms of differentiating paid labour from work, because I think paid labour is the kind of thing that most of the discourse kind of talks about, that we need to disconnect ourselves from and talk in broader terms. Stephen, harder question. The brief answer is small little groups of people starting to build, like this one here, like the Nina group that Jane and others are heavily involved in, and a few kind of key advocates, a few academics, obviously, that I'm sure many of you know, folks like Greg Marston and Ben Spies-Butcher and John Quiggin and Elise Klein.
I have to interrupt there. I don't think John Quiggin is in favour of a basic income, because we had him on with Jane, and there was a bit of, I don't mean to, Jane can maybe clarify this, but there was the living income guarantee proposal, which had a much softer, much less conditionality, but still some. Now, there seemed to be that some of those authors saw that as a stepping stone to a more universal system. But John seemed to be the one who still sort of basically says, no, we can't afford it. We can't afford it. It's too expensive. It's not politically viable. It's all a bit, you know, he didn't seem enthusiastic, at least.
Yeah, I think that's a comment. I think he's shifted a bit, which is interesting. He's shifted a bit away from it. A couple of years ago, I would have said he was a much more active advocate, and now he kind of seems to be talking more in terms of it's not really feasible, so let's go with, I think he's very keen on this living income guarantee idea, which is a really good stepping stone, and others involved in it see it as a stepping stone. He's quite committed to it.
Can I make a brief comment?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Having worked with the group, I think you can spend another century trying to sell the principle, and I've spent several years myself trying to do it. Don't sell the principle, sell a plan. There are 24 mayors in America who are already mounting basic income, but they're not necessarily calling it that. The point of that group, I think, was to sell a plan. If you sell a plan, people's view of the principle starts to change. And so it's the old metaphor of carts and horses, maybe. Nobody's abandoned the idea of basic income in that group from the discussions I've seen. And many of the participants are very fiercely committed to it. But you've got to make some movements. Otherwise, you're just kind of playing the old ideology game forever.
I'll just jump in before we go to the next groups. And it seems like, according to the polling, and we'll get to the numbers, that a lot of people are sold on the principle. That maybe we should be talking about plans, because the principle seems to have widespread public support. We haven't actually got to those headline numbers yet, so stay tuned. We'll be getting to that. But
well, you've got to sell it to government. So
I would argue you very much need both, and that's kind of why I was making that point about shifting the discourse and building the power as well at the same time. I think we do need to sell the principles, and you can sell the principles through a plan. Where I get skeptical is when you start to sell a plan which is actually not necessarily getting you to those principles, which I'm not suggesting the LIG plan is, but there certainly are cases where that's the case. To get back briefly to Stephen's question, I also wanted to make the point that there are small groups within other groups of people starting to make change within larger organisations. I know a number of people within the kind of the broader social services sector at Brotherhood of St. Lawrence and ACOS and places like that, who are really personally convinced of the idea of a UBI and seeking to shift the organisational movements behind them. There are obviously a number of people across the broader union movement in Australia who are keen on the idea of a UBI, who are bit by bit chipping away at the opposition. And I think that's really, really critical. I do also think, and I've written kind of elsewhere, that we need to start thinking kind of outside the box a bit about kinds of civil society groups we work with. And I mentioned kind of feminist organizations and faith groups. I think they're reasonably obvious ones. I think obviously, there may be space, and I certainly know a few Indigenous activists who are very firmly convinced by the idea. And there are other places to look. There's a lot of folks in the arts sector, actually, and I say that as a musician and artist myself. There's a lot of folks in the arts sector who are really, really intrigued by the idea of UBI and pushing quite hard. So there are other ways to think about it, and other kind of paths to look at. But I'd love to have that discussion at length at some point.
Yeah, and we should. And I think we're going to have multiple. We're going to be doing this every month, and hopefully we can. We'll have you back on subsequent shows as well to discuss some of that sort of strategic landscape. I want to get now to George, Josh, and then Douglas. We're going to do 3 questions in a row, starting with George. Go right ahead. I think I've sent you all requests to unmute now. But so George, Josh, then Douglas. Go ahead with your questions.
Thanks. So I guess that the pandemic has given a lot of people who wouldn't otherwise be in the situation of thinking about how they're going to put food on their table into a very different mindset. So nevertheless, a crisis go to waste, as they say. However, as soon as the economy goes gangbusters again, people are going to forget it. It's going to slip, and things get busy in their lives, and it goes into the backwaters of their mind. I think that there are, as someone mentioned, a number of places and people who have the money and the wherewithal to do little experiments here and there, mainly in the US, I think, but also to some extent in Europe, also Africa, I believe. My question, though, is that with people's interest is, it's a nice idea. That's nice. Wouldn't that be nice? What's that? I have to pay extra taxes. Not so much now. So in terms of getting them past that, it's a nice idea stage into the nuts and bolts of how it's actually going to be funded. I get that you need a foundation, an understanding of what the baseline is in the population, who might support that, and that being the purpose of the poll, and that's good. So, obviously those who are looking after elderly or just looking after people in their environments, their family, people who have been made redundant or in the gig economy and precarious nature of employment. So where am I going with all of this? I guess I'm edging towards how do you move from the planning and the baseline stage to keeping people engaged once you discuss the nuts and bolts. And my own favorite on it is giving them the means to fiddle with the levers and the mechanisms and the feedback mechanisms to get a sense for themselves of how it might be funded, how it might work. Anyway, that's my piece. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, guys.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. Josh?
Hello, Tim. So my question is, I'm just wondering if you could talk. You've talked about the logic behind why you would want to do the polling. Can you talk a little bit about the process of which company you picked, why you picked them, the process of the methodology behind it? I've mentioned this in an email to you before, but something I've heard from some people is, well, it was only 1,000 people who were polled, therefore it's not representative of Australia.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in there as a disinterested party who used to work in a polling center. I used to work at Newspoll, so I know how polling works, and you only ever do 1,000 people, right? 1,000 people will work for a population of any size up to, you can be doing the United States, you can be doing 300 million people. A sample size of 1,000 people properly statistically selected will be right, and that's what YouGov's job is to get that right. And I know that when I was working in Newspoll, they could predict election results with an error margin of error of about 2%. And that they didn't have superpowers. They just used regular old. So I'm happy for Tim to go into some of the more interesting questions about methodology, but that's a boring question, and we're not going to waste his time with it. In terms of, is 1,000 people enough? Because yes, it is. That's established as a standard in polling. But Douglas, you had a question too. Were you
it's more of a statement. Thanks, Tim, for all your efforts in the Greens Institute. It's fantastic work. I read one of the early papers where people were telling their own opinions on it. Cool. And thanks for doing this poll as well. It's fantastic work. Just a quick shameless plug. The Australian Progressives that I've been a member of for over a year now have passed it as part of their official policy that they support a universal basic income. So there's a bit of good news for everyone.
That's really good news.
Does it have a number on it? Is there an amount? Did they?
Well, I don't see any reason why I can't tell you how many. How much to give people? No specifics on the amount. So our platforms are very short and simple. The stances we take, because obviously the devil is in the details. So that's just the sort of thing we'd work out. Obviously, it's unrealistic that we'll enter and gain power ourselves. But I think that obviously this platform speaks for itself and speaks to the fact that where we stand on the issues. So that's largely where our stance is. But we also passed a wealth tax. And my specific example, because I heard obviously that some economists find that it's not affordable, and that's a shame. And I was previously in the Labor Party and spoke to Chris Bowen and Andrew Lee, and it's definitely the case that they hold this kind of dogmatic view, which is hard to avoid considering the name of their party. So fair enough, really. So I just thought I might throw out that good news, and I actually put together a website that does prove affordability, but I'll give that to everyone later, I guess.
Okay, great. I can see Colin Hargraves from Universal Basic Income Party of Australia in the chat physically raising his hand rather than doing it digitally. So Colin, we'll save a plug for UBIPA for a little bit further on. Tim, do you want to respond?
Wasn't a plug for UBIPA.
Okay. Well, I just assumed because we were talking about parties that support it, that would be coming up. But Tim, please go ahead and respond to those points. We had we had at the beginning. I might
go Douglas.
George.
Yeah, I might respond briefly to Douglas, talk about George's big question, and then use Josh's to kind of pivot into talking about the polling. Will I do that?
Perfect.
Cool. Douglas, all I wanted to say is good stuff. I've had quite a bit to do with Rob Knight from the Progressives here in Canberra. We ran kind of together at the last campaign and got on very well, and I'm delighted to hear that. That's good news. I think anybody in the political scene advocating for UBI, the more the merrier, the more the better. George, big question. I think that deserves a kind of a whole session, or that is the fundamental question, really, isn't it? Is how do we do this? It's what Jane, I think, was kind of talking about as well in terms of is it the model or is it the principle? It's the big question of how do you deliver change? How do you campaign for change? It's the kind of stuff that I and numerous others have been thinking about in the climate space for decades. The one kind of thing I wanted to kind of, there's a couple of things. The one little thing I kind of just wanted to respond to briefly was, you said when things go back to normal economically. I would suggest that they might not, they actually just might not. We're at that point in history. So there's question marks over that. In terms of kind of the how, there's all sorts of stuff around kind of, I characterized it sort of as shift the discourse and build the power. And it's about, kind of using political communications in various ways to kind of build a narrative in that direction and shift the political common sense. And part of the way you do that is through building constituencies who are demanding the change and understanding what the benefits of what the change can be. And Douglas mentioned that paper that the Green Institute put out a couple of years ago, which you can see on our website, called Views of the UBI, which was kind of part of that. We got a carer and an Indigenous person and a farmer and a student and a bunch of people to kind of write little reflections on what a UBI would mean for them. And I think that's a kind of a part of that critical path. And it's just about sort of bit by bit chipping away at how do we bring more people into support for this policy, and how do we build the political power behind it so that it gets implemented over time. So to Josh's question and to the polling, yeah, as Austin intervened, 1,000 people is the international global standard for polling. It is statistically valid. Austin also made the point about electoral polling and that you have about a 2% margin of error for 1,000 poll. Now, yeah, that might be as high as 3. Some people kind of reckon now, given recent results, it could be higher than 3, even because of the way people don't respond necessarily to certain polls. And I've certainly seen pre-election polls that have been higher than 3% wrong. But in electoral polling, that's the thing. In electoral polling, 3% can be the difference, well and truly, between win or lose a swag of seats. It can be the difference between Brexit, no chance, Brexit, oh, that happened. In electoral polling, 2%, 3% matters. In this poll that we did, the margin of error is left in the dust. So we did a poll of 1,026 people through YouGov, who are a major polling organisation. There are kind of 3 major polling organisations left in Australia who do this kind of thing. YouGov's one of the major ones. We pitched it to a few of them. They came back with a good price. That's as simple as it is. And then we worked with them on developing a couple of questions that they thought would. The critical thing was giving people enough information around a question which most people don't actually know much about at this point, without giving them so much that you're kind of prejudicing the question. So they helped us frame these questions. And I might just tell you the results now, although many of you will probably have seen the top line. So we asked first the question about unconditional income support so that people would have more of an idea about what we were talking about first. That was YouGov's advice. So we asked these 1,026 people. Currently, for every job advertised, there are at least 15 job seekers. Given this information, to what extent do you agree or disagree that we should provide unconditional income support to those out of work, i.e. without the requirement to apply for a certain number of jobs, a specified number of hours of designated work activities? So in response to that, we're
Tim's muted.
Somebody muted me. Am I back? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me? Sorry, yes, Tim, go ahead.
Great.
We can hear you fine.
So, yeah, 50% agreement to that question. Do you support unconditional income support? 50% agreement, with 23% of them strongly agreed. And here's the thing, only 24% disagree. So if it was 50% to 50%, margin of error, that's really close. 50% agree, only 24% disagree, 11% strongly disagree, and 30% somewhat disagree. So that's a really big differential. The remainder being don't know at 6%, and a full 20% saying neither agree nor disagree. So you've got very clear preferences being indicated there. Almost as many said neither as disagree. So there's a strong, solid half saying they agree. The rest split between kind of don't know, don't care, and not really agreed. So there's not much opposition and very little strong opposition to making income support unconditional. And that shouldn't really be surprising because as I've kind of discussed at the beginning, conditional welfare is the weapon that forces us into intolerable labour and conditions. So we shouldn't be surprised that it's not popular. And then we framed the UBI question like this. Unconditional income support is sometimes called a guaranteed living wage or a universal basic income. This means that just as we can rely on basic healthcare and education, everyone in the society has a guaranteed minimum amount of money that they can rely on. Would you support or oppose a guaranteed living wage being introduced in Australia? And here the results were actually even starker. We recorded 58% support, 29% strong support and 29% somewhat support, and only 18% oppose at all, 10% somewhat oppose and 8% strongly oppose. Remarkably, 19%, more than the total opposed, said neither support nor oppose. So there's a chunk in the middle well, kind of not even in the middle. 20% saying, don't know, don't care. Less than 20% saying, don't like the idea. 58%, almost 2/3 really, saying they support the idea. Margin of error out the window, left in the dust. 2, 3, 5% margin of error, doesn't matter in this circumstance. We know we've got very few people in the community opposing UBI and a solid, substantial majority supporting the UBI. So they're the numbers that we came out with.
Really amazing stuff. And I think it's worth noting that there's actually better numbers for the universal basic income than just making unemployment conditions. The more radical, more universal approach has the stronger numbers. And I think that, I was surprised by that personally. Howard, we're going to get to your question in just a minute, by the way. I wanted to let you know that I have seen your hand's been up for a while. I just want to respond very quickly to this, that there's to me, that makes sense that a truly unconditional payment where when you start work, you don't lose it, actually has stronger support because there's it escapes this sort of, some of the problems that come with conditional welfare, where there is actually a disincentive to enter the workforce because you go off the payment, then you might have to apply to get back on. But you have these extra expenses involved with actually meeting your requirements and doing the job, like you might have to buy new clothes or travel or whatever. So, but it's often just assumed. So to me, that's, it's a more attractive proposal of basic income. But it's often just assumed that the smaller change is going to be more sellable and more popular. But these numbers show us that that's not always the case. Do you have any further comments on that, or should we move on to Howard's question?
Yeah, I would just briefly argue that that's remarkably frequently the case, actually. And it's one of those bizarre mythologies of politics that's kind of developed, I think, from the centre, from this idea of kind of compromise and balance and centre left and centre right, that you've got to kind of not scare the horses and big proposals are scary. I think we've seen so much evidence in recent years that big proposals are actually much more popular. The Green New Deal, universal healthcare in the USA, these big ideas that excite people. They stimulate the imagination. They make people go, things could be different. Here's somebody who's actually talking about, making life better. And the others are kind of just tinkering around the edges. What do I care for tinkering around the edges? I want change. And that's going to scare some people. Totally. Yep. There's going to be 8% who will fight us really hard against the UBI. But if we've got 60% in favour, we beat them.
Yeah, I remember there's a line that always comes to me from Obama's campaign in 2008 before he took power and became much more moderate. He said at one stage, it's not the bigness of our problems that scares me, it's the smallness of our politics. And that's the line that's always stuck with me. It's like, if only he'd sort of carried that into office. But anyhow, we won't go to that. Now let's go to, let me just get the view here. Let's go to Howard. Howard, you can unmute yourself and go right ahead.
Hi, Tim. Look, I've missed a lot of the talk, unfortunately, so apologies if I'm asking stuff that's already been covered. Now, from what I can gather, the way the survey was framed was talking about the current situation, more or less. So, in other words, people, I would say, judging from that, would be happy under a COVID kind of situation with such high unemployment for the UBI to effectively be brought in. So, and the government has kind of done that, but now they're bringing it back without much real opposition. So we've kind of, met the criteria of the survey. So we'd have to look beyond the COVID situation to actually understand properly what people would support if we were not in this situation. The other thing is, a couple of other things. Firstly, when we explain why the UBI is beneficial, we normally talk about stuff like single parents or people who are made redundant. So the thing is, what I'm suggesting to you is that, is it a possibility to look at targeting the introduction of an unconditional government benefit in the interim for groups that people generally have no objection as to, people that should get benefits, like single parents or people that have lost their jobs in industries that have been made redundant, coal industry, let's say, for example, or let's say the retirement age. I mean, should we be looking at lowering the retirement age rather than increasing it or even keeping it the same? So what I'm saying is, if I'm quite happy with the UBI, but if there is opposition, is it a feasible proposal to actually look at introducing it in the interim through those particular areas, or would it undermine the proposal in the long term? The other thing is, I'm actually a union delegate and councillor in the arts. So I was interested when you were talking about basically support within the unions and also within the arts. I mean, if you could just give a bit of detail, just to give me a bit of heads up about where I should be looking.
On that last, I'm happy to introduce you to a few people, actually. Don't know if you know David Pledger. Not yet, it's difficult. He's really strongly behind it. Theatre director and playwright, really interesting guy. Dario Vasiuka, who's also an actor and musician based in the Illawarra, heavily behind it. And there's been quite a bit of discussion I've seen around the place through the arts front group quite a bit as well. I'm actually a member of the Musicians Union. That's my union, has been for a very long time, and I've kind of been meaning to raise it with the Alliance broadly, because I think obviously for artists, but also actually for the media side of the Alliance, for journalists, it actually makes a hell of a lot of sense for journalists at this moment to swing behind it. So I've been meaning to raise it with the Alliance, and if you're a delegate with the Alliance, let's talk. Is the short answer to that. I'd love to talk. In response to your question about kind of the does it make sense to start somewhere, or does it undermine? That's a really big question, and I don't have an answer to it. What I do have a response to, hello, introducing my cat. What I do have a comment on in that front is that there's been a really interesting proposal from a couple of academics, Ben Spies-Butcher and Troy Henderson, who some of you may know, of what they called a stepping stones approach, which they really wanted to kind of separate from the idea of trials, because there's, Carl Widerquist in particular has made clear points that the time has passed for trials, and trials actually can act very, very much as kind of a undermining movement towards UBI. And they talk about a stepping stones approach. Their proposal was to start kind of precisely as you're suggesting, with making the age pension universal and unconditional, and then also at the same time introducing a universal and unconditional youth allowance, and incrementally bringing them together, increasing the age of the youth allowance and reducing the age of the pension. And also talking about the potential for kind of, for other spaces as well, like Indigenous communities, returning to the CDEP and things like that, to approach it as we're going to introduce it to chunks of the community bit by bit, but we're going to do it as unconditional, and slowly move towards the universal, which I think is a fascinating proposal and one that's worth considering.
Can I, I'm going to jump in there, and there's another way to do this, which I know that our sometimes co-host Michael Haynes supports, and other people around this in the movement, is that rather than starting with a section of the population and introducing a full payment to them, you start with the whole population and you introduce a partial payment. And this has the advantage that you're not replacing anything. You're not taking anybody off the unemployment payment. That stays in place. You're not taking anybody off of a carer's payment. Everything else stays in place, including the aged pension and these other income support payments. And then you introduce this other payment, which is the universal one, and you grow that over time. But you start by giving us perhaps a less than living amount and giving it to everybody. And then when everyone looks around and the sky doesn't fall and there's not bread lines and there's, it doesn't so there's two distinct approaches in terms of how you get there. One is by having a full payment that goes to a select number, a less than a full part of the population, or you have the full population, you have less than a full payment. So I just thought I'd throw that in as another option. If you want to respond to that, that's fine, or we can go to Douglas, who's got a question.
Really super briefly, I personally prefer the unconditional first rather than the universal first. I think a small payment is likely to end up being too small to make any difference to anyone, and people would kind of go, don't really see the point of it. But that's my personal opinion based on nothing.
Okay. The idea would be about testing the macroeconomic effects and whether we get runaway inflation or something like that. So it's kind of the economists rather than think what's the economics of rolling it in rather than what's the politics of rolling it in.
Yeah, right.
Let's go to Douglas and see what his question is.
Can I just add something on that last point?
Okay.
A small payment actually makes a big difference to people on low incomes. So it's, for them, it's actually quite substantial.
Yeah,
True.
if you're on Centrelink, an extra $50 a week is a substantial amount of money. I can guarantee you that.
True, yeah.
Douglas, please go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Howard and Austin. I think that one of its appeals is the fact that it can help small business owners, people on marginal incomes, and that sort of thing. Everybody's due for a raise, and we underpay everyone. But that aside, I've posted a link in the chat comments of a calculator I put together early last year. And I haven't made it very public yet because it was mostly to try and convince my party first. So it actually uses a wealth tax, basically. And it proves that you can only have to tax about 0.65% of the population on a wealth tax in order to fund a UBI which meets the basic standard of living. So give it a look, see what you think, and use it as ammunition if you need it. I'm open to being contacted if you have questions about it.
One person you should be in touch with is Peter Zing from Singularity University, because they're talking about having a hackathon where they would be doing a bunch of UBI modeling, Zing with a Z-I-N-G. And if you message any of us, I'm sure anyone who's involved in this will be able to help you get in touch with him as well. He's a regular attendee of these discussions, not with us this particular one, but you should definitely reach out to him. Now, do you, Tim, do you have something else to add? Because I've got a question I'd like to ask. If you
come on, Austin, can I please talk?
Sure, Colin. You're
blocking me out.
No, I'm not meaning to block you out. Let's hear from Colin. What you're meant to be doing is using the raise hand feature on Zoom. That's how I'm keeping track.
I can't see that, but
yeah, okay.
Anyhow, you know what I wanted to say to me. Thanks for you mentioning UB, but I wasn't going to mention it. What I was going to say is that it seems strange to me that we are discussing what would be a complete transformational change in our society, but we're only discussing one side, a side where everybody basically is agreed on the moral or philosophical benefit of a UBI. What we're not discussing is what the public is upset about, and that is how do we pay for it? So I think we ought to, well, one thing we could consider is couching the discussion of a UBI within a quite serious reform of taxation. There are so many forms of taxation that we don't use at all. Financial transactions tax, carbon tax, there's a whole series of other things. And I think it would be very good to us to put this to the public. How do you want to be taxed? Do you want to be taxed like you are now, in which case we'll have to do this to pay for this? Or do you want to introduce, say, a financial transactions tax, which would evenly cover it, or a death tax? So if you put the whole lot together, then the public might accept it as a good package. But at the moment, it's just something we can't afford. Anyhow, think about it.
I first I want to say one thing is we did do the last discussion we had, the last of these talks was the big picture, taxation, inflation, funding a UBI. And in that I presented my point of view, which is that actually I think we have what we're seeing right now and what we've seen throughout history is that the reality is that taxes don't fund spending. If you want to tax, it's because you want to prevent something. Taxing is about stopping inequality. Taxing is about stopping carbon pollution. Taxing is about preventing inflation by pulling money out of the economy in places where it's getting too hot. That's my personal point of view. So my view is that we actually don't to talk about everything on this sort of zero sum, if we spend money here, we've got to tax someone there thing, is inaccurate for a start. For example, right now what's happening is that the Reserve Bank is buying government bonds from the open market. So we're already using money printing to fund government spending. We've done that historically when there's been a major project like a war, or a major economic program. It's how we're doing infrastructure spending now. So this idea of having to balance the budget, I feel, is like a bit of a, I'll get Tim's response as well, but I think that it's a bit of a trick that's used as an excuse for not being able to do things that would actually benefit the population, as an excuse for keeping the population desperate, where we're always told that, how are you going to pay for it? The money's going to run out. And I don't think that that's actually real. And I don't think we should play into that. But Tim, that's one of my bugbears personally. What's your response to that?
So I'm very, very sympathetic to the modern monetary theory approach, which I think, as I understand it, and I'm not an economist, rings true in many ways. Where I differ from it is kind of from a political strategy point of view, actually, which is that in fact, by not talking about tax and taxing certain sectors, we actually lose a really powerful political tool, in fact. And I would embrace that approach, Colin. One of the things I'm actually really interested in about the UBI conversation, and I totally acknowledge I skipped over it completely today, but there's so much depth to this question, you just can't talk about everything. One of the reasons I'm really interested in the idea is because it does actually open up space to say, how do we make our tax and spend system? How do we make our economy fairer? How do we make it send the right signals? And I think Douglas's point that we could introduce a wealth tax on, a substantial tax on a very small number of very rich people, that would raise enough money to cover the cost of something like this, is actually, whether or not under MMT it's accurate, it's actually a very politically powerful thing to say, because it would be immensely popular, I dare say, immensely popular. So I think that's kind of the slight differentiation that I have there with the main MMT approach. And I guess I would note, kind of drawing it back to that previous point, and I take the point and feel my wrist a little bit slapped on saying a small payment wouldn't make a difference. And yes, it would make a difference to the people who are really struggling, very, very much so. The cynic in me says, if those people were a powerful constituency, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It kind of doesn't matter if it makes a difference to the poorest politically. We need to make a difference to the vast bulk of people in the middle and show them what a difference it makes, because that's where the political power, unfortunately, currently lies. And one of the reasons we need a UBI is to change that. So, yeah.
I want to jump in there really quickly. I think that there's a broader question of the sort of closing off of political possibility, which has been a sort of gradual process, I think, of one of the great victory of neoliberalism is presenting itself as this natural system to which there's no alternative. Mm. And I would say this idea of, the deficit, how are we going to pay for it, is another expression of that, of the closing off of political imagination, and the sort of limiting the possibilities of which begins in conversation.
And I very much agree with that. I would also note that you don't need actually to go to MMT to be thinking in those terms. Keynesianism says exactly the same thing. So
I would say that there's a school of people around MMT, and within MMT you've got a sort of a pro-tax, a sort of an anti-tax wing, right, and a pro-spending wing. There are two people, but I think it's important for us to present what we really think, rather than get too clever in trying to guess what's going to be sellable to the public. But there's a book which is written by a proponent of this sort of soft money theory. You could call it this broader, that there's not a finite amount of money in the economy. We have to look at how it's created and destroyed. And it's actually called The Joy of Tax. And the point he makes is, if you tax because you want to tax, you tax rich people because you don't like them being so rich, not because otherwise we can't have a UBI, or not because otherwise we can't have a Green New Deal or whatever. The taxing the rich is its own reward. We don't need another reason to do that. But look, Douglas and Josh have got their hands up. But I'm going to go to them, but I'll ask them to be very quick, because I want to get on to, and there's a really important thing we haven't discussed yet, which is the media, your interaction with the media, trying to get this poll out there to people, which I think is an important thing. It gives us some insights into the political landscape. But Josh and Douglas, if you want to go ahead, we'll go Josh first, then Douglas. But let's try and keep it under a minute each, okay? So we can move on and get some closing thoughts as well.
Okay, I just have a quick one that's kind of a follow-up to what I asked before. You mentioned that you worked with YouGov to develop the questions. I've heard some criticism saying that the questions are too leading. Can you talk a bit about the back and forth between how the questions were decided? And also I'm wondering about, what do you think this can be used as a weapon for? How can we use this as a tool to get us further in the discussion than we currently are?
Douglas, you go ahead first, and then we'll get Tim to respond to both.
Like the referendum on the Republic, it's possible to lose the battle of ideas by being too much detailed about how you plan on implementing something. That being said, I do have a favorite way of implementing UBI, which is via a wealth tax, because I think that they're perfectly married to one another, because they reinforce one another. People are worried about governments irresponsibly spending the money that's taxed, but then you say, well, it's going straight to you, so you can decide how it's spent. And then obviously people don't like people having too much money, and obviously taxation, you tax that whichever you want to discourage. So excessive wealth is something we all want to discourage, I think.
Tim?
Response to that briefly, yes, I am very fond of the idea of a wealth tax. I think it's outrageous that we don't have one. I think any reasonable society would have a very, very substantial wealth tax. I actually would like to take it to its logical extension and basically say we have a minimum wage, we should also have a maximum wage. And the tax, our tax system should be so progressive that it gets to a point where above a certain point, you're basically paying 99% tax, essentially. It just makes sense. Yeah, I think I'm very firmly behind that idea. Josh, in terms of the to and fro, there's not much to say except that a reputable polling company will not put a question into the field which is too leading. They won't, because it's their reputation at stake. So yeah, we went back and forth. We crafted these questions and we got them to a point where YouGov, who need to protect their own reputation, were comfortable that they were questions that were, as I said, framed clearly enough so that people would understand what we were talking about, but not so clearly that they become leading questions. So yeah, it's just so central to a polling company's business. They're not going to do it. They're not going to put questions into the field which will undermine their own reputation.
All right. I now want to move on. We've got about 15 minutes left.
Wait, there was another part. Sorry. The idea of like, how can we use this as a weapon moving forward?
Right. Oh, yeah. Get it out there. Talk to people. I've sent it to the people who I know, who are in the ones I was mentioning in response to Stephen's question earlier, people who are in other organizations that I think currently are acting as something of barriers to the implementation of the UBI, but actually share our views. I've sent it around to those kinds of people to help them in their work. I think all of us can be using it in that way. I think it's critical to kind of start building that narrative around the fact that, actually the political class hates this idea broadly, but most people like it. And there's good reason, of course, there's good reason for why they like it. And let's start talking about that. And let's start talking about the fact that there's this massive differentiation between what the political class are arguing and what most people believe. I think that's a really useful part of making that change. But over time, yeah, I think we use this and more polling and more campaigning and just building these conversations around the place to build towards that story that actually this is popular. And once you get enough momentum around that, you start to see chinks appear. One group will suddenly change their position, and then another one will change their position, and then a political party will change its position, and eventually you move to a position where things change.
Now, I think that this is going to be something that sort of seeps out, because it's going to come up in conversations again and again and again. People often will throw this idea into the mix that, oh, it's not a popular idea, it's outside the political mainstream. And every time that point is made, it can just be sort of pretty much blown away with reference to this data. So I think, and once you know it, you can't unknow it, right? So it's a really important foundational piece of data for us to move forward on. And the other thing is, it was surprising, especially the low negatives.
Yeah.
Now, if you have a long question where you have there's a guarantee, universal basic income, maybe you get more people on board with that, but maybe you also get more people offside, because the more names you use, the more description you give, the more there is actually the potential for someone to say, actually, no, I don't like that. And that didn't happen with this question. So you have this incredibly low negatives, which is really important in politics, we're always told. And it's also something which was surprising to me and should have been more surprising, I think, to other people who are who have been working from the assumption that this is a fringe idea. So in that context, you would expect, oh, this is verifiable data and it's really surprising. You would think it was big news. So when you went to journalists, did they react like this was a big story? Or tell us a little bit about that process of placing the actual, getting the information out there.
It was really hard, which didn't surprise me, because it's always really hard. Most journalists in Australia haven't thought about UBI and don't really want to think about UBI. It's a big idea. It's a big question. It's too difficult. I had, one of the reasons I wanted to do polling, frankly, is because polls make it easy for journalists to write about the ideas. So I was a bit disappointed. I pitched it to the one journalist at the former Fairfax papers who's written a bit about it, and he was interested and his editors scratched it. I pitched it to a couple of people at ABC who didn't get back to me. One of the main people was on leave, unfortunately. In fact, two of the main people were on leave. I mean, this is one of the things when when you're doing media liaison. I took it to The Guardian, didn't get any response from the two people at The Guardian I thought might be interested. And eventually I got somebody at the ABC through the help of one of the journalists who was on leave, who kindly actually got back to me and introduced me to another journalist who was interested in it, and did a really fantastic job, I must say, did a really great job of the story. And after Gareth Hutchins ran that story, a couple of other kind of smaller outlets picked it up as well and ran with it. But yeah, it is absolutely the case that most of our media doesn't want to have this conversation. It's too difficult. They don't like it. It's a big idea.
I think that's really interesting, and it tells us something about society, because it's one of the things was, I remember when in the US there was some polling in the UK and Europe, there started being polling showing basic income was popular in those places. And I was in some online communities with people from that, and they're like, "Oh my God, we're winning!" And then it becomes this point. It's like, well, welcome to, political activism, right, where you can have majority support, but if that's not among the elites, if it's only amongst the ordinary people, then you're still sort of in a really difficult position. Like things like Medicare covering dental, or increasing the minimum wage, or lots of ideas that have huge popular support. And as somebody
who's been a climate activist for 20 years, I remember doing polling in the early 2000s about support for 100% renewables. It was already in the kind of the 70-80% range 20 bloody years ago. So yeah, the limits to polling are real, but nevertheless it is a useful political tool for convincing people that there is momentum behind something.
What's interesting to me is not the limits of the polling, it's the inability of the system to represent, it's the limits of our democracy that are being displayed here. Absolutely. Right? And this is, I think it's related to basic income as well. When you have a population that are, in this constant state of precarity or near precarity, that actually demobilizes the population in general. So there's the David Graeber argument that you know, that a lot of the economic pushback against social democracy came from a place of elites being scared of losing power. That if people had too much economic security, you would get a cultural and, you know, deeper changes to society which couldn't be held back. And I think that comes in, you know, at the very beginning, we didn't really get enough of a chance to respond to it because, you know, there was so much great stuff in that initial introduction. But you said this is a revolutionary idea, a basic income. And it's often criticized from the left as not being revolutionary enough. Oh, let's not bother with it because there'll still be a market and there'll still be, you know, Amazon will still have a monopoly. All, you know, there's all these problems that it apparently won't solve.
Yeah.
And I think that misses how foundational to our system poverty and the threat of poverty is, which is finally enforced by violence, right? If you tried to go and, you know, by the property system, which is enforced by violence, right? So this idea that this is a fundamentally revolutionary idea and a real threat to existing power structures. And I think that that's something that's represented in the difficulty getting it covered in the media, the way the media sort of has an immune system that pushes out dangerous ideas.
And the decommodification of us as humans, I think, is so central to that, as I said at the beginning, which really brings us to the interesting conversation that's going on in the comments thread that I'm kind of vaguely trying to chip into occasionally and discuss this question of, you know, socialism. Is this bringing down capitalism? Is it socialism? Is it, you know, is it what is socialism, authoritarianism? Well, I think this last bit of the conversation really brings us to the point that actually one of the extraordinary successes of liberal capitalism is convincing people that it is democratic and that socialism is anti-democratic and authoritarianism, whereas in fact, this system is extraordinarily authoritarian, extraordinarily so. The power of the existing elites imposed at the final, you know, point by violence, as you say, Austin, the monopoly on violence that the liberal state holds. This is an extraordinarily authoritarian system that we're living in, which is increasingly, obviously, not actually very democratic, where you have mass public support for policies which no major party is interested in implementing, no potential party of government is interested in implementing. What we saw in state socialism in the 20th century was horrific. I will be one of the first to say that. I don't actually identify as a socialist, which shocks a lot of people, partly because of the horrors of state socialism of the 20th century, which I know very well because both my parents were refugees from state socialist countries. It was not democratic, it was not socialist, frankly. So we shouldn't really use those systems as a critique of socialism. But there are plenty of other alternatives. The opposite, as I said in the comments, the opposite of capitalism does not have to be socialism, unless you use the word socialism purely as a catch-all for anything that's not capitalism, which some people do. But yeah, there's a fascinating conversation to be had there. I really think that UBI is a truly revolutionary idea because it decommodifies us. It separates this, you know, the capacity to live from the need to sell your labor at all costs. It changes so many of the fundamentals of our society. And in having that conversation, as Colin pointed out and others, you know, we can also have the conversation about, you know, wealth taxes and all of those kinds of things and truly, you know, trying to build an egalitarian society that UBI does, not just economically. That's the critical thing. UBI isn't just an economic policy to make our access to money more equal. It actually is a power equalizer as well, because it says to every member of our society, we care about you, we care about everyone. Universalism is fundamentally a power equalizer. And I think this is one of the reasons why the union movement should get behind it too. People have talked about UBI as a universal strike fund. You know, this is actually about giving people the capacity to say, you don't treat me well in your job, stuff you, I'm leaving. I can leave. I actually can just leave. It's massively powerful for the union movement to get behind an idea like that. So yeah, I really do think it is a very revolutionary idea, and one of those which is also very, very, very popular. But it's also, as you say, Austin, that's why it's really difficult to get purchase with it from those whose whose actual raison d'etre is to maintain the status quo.
Now we're gonna do one final round of questions, and then we're gonna get Tim to answer those questions. Or we've got two people are lowering their hands. Why are people lowering their hands? Now I won't be able to find you. Okay, thank you, Jane and Douglas. I'm going to get to you in a sec, but I'm going to put another question in there as the first of these three questions, which is going to be mine, my prerogative as host. This is about, so you say you were talking about decommodifying the human being so that we have a value that's outside of our ability to sell our labor. One of the things that does is liberate the individual, but it also moves the position of it gives people leverage inside the labor market that comes from outside the labor market, right? The universal basic income gives you an option to exit. And do you think that is one reason that some people in organized labor don't like it, because it actually reduces it in one sense? Their business is the conflict in the workplace, and by moving some of the leverage outside it, they may have actually stronger leverage, but they'll have a less central role. And there's sort of a thing that if people aren't workers, they're not paying their dues, they're not building the labor movement, they're not building that position. Now I'll let you respond to that after we've had Jane and Douglas add their questions too. Please go ahead, Jane.
A little bit of a rewind to the point about getting the story out there and the block that's put before it by most of the mainstream media outlets. I mean, the other way in which stories get out is through the celebrity factor. There's a celebrity factor in journalists, whether people know the name of this or that writer or journalist. And I was at a session in the Adelaide Festival where Yanis Varoufakis was talking. And in question time at the end, he just threw out this suggestion that we should try basic income. And he gave an example of one of the European, trials or part trials. And the guy who hosts the ABC's Big Ideas on the radio, what's his name? I forget.
Richard Aydin.
Immediately grabbed the microphone and said, "I must get you on my show." I thought, crikey, Charlie, do you think nobody else in this country has ever thought of this or would be able to come on your program and talk about it? He's not going to ring Tim Hollow up, but all Yanis Varoufakis has to do is kind of drop a pearl at the Adelaide Festival and suddenly he's interested. Stories are so driven by names, name recognition, but I think that is starting to change. I think there are more and more independent media outlets. More and more of them are getting traction. It's small, but it's happening. And certainly the capacity of social media and Zoom to spin more interest in a story is pretty strong.
Okay. Douglas, do you have something else to add before we get back to Tim for closing comments?
Yeah, no, I was just, because there's this left versus right sort of thing going on in the chat, and I was just thinking about the fact that, wealth tax, I would hazard a guess, is actually more popular than a universal basic income because people can comprehend it much quicker. People do see that.
Sorry, do you have any data that suggests that's the case?
I know that
we've just got polling that shows how popular UBI is, and yet this whole conversation we're filled with people sort of talking about what are we going to do to overcome all this public resistance, which doesn't seem to exist.
Yeah, no, indeed, sure. Anyway, but in regards to reaching out to the 99%, as it were, for lack of a better phrase, I spoke to a lady who had a pest control family business, and they had a lot of down season and stuff, and their kids had grown up. And so they had lots of difficulty managing money and getting by. And I explained to her that if both her sons received a UBI and she received a UBI and her husband received a UBI, all of a sudden their entire family would have a boost that would back up their entire lifestyle during those off seasons of pest control. And then she suggested to me that Liberal and Labor have to have a combined picnic someday. So, but unfortunately, UBI wasn't adopted by Labor, so nothing took off. But But anyway, I just issue that story as a sign of hope that this is something that really does reach the 99% and really does benefit many people. But something we have to embrace is the fact that we're going to make enemies of the 1%.
Yeah,
Tim.
we have to embrace that. We have to do it. It's the only, you can't solve, I am very happy to say you cannot solve any of the crises that our world currently faces without taking on the 1%. It's just not possible. That 1%, and not even the 1%, the 0.001%, it just should not exist. There is no reason for anyone to be sitting on $200 billion, for goodness sake, no reason in the world. We could take away 99.9% of Elon Musk's wealth, and he wouldn't notice. It's completely insane. So we have to take on the super wealthy. We absolutely have to. So yeah, completely agree with that. Jane, completely agree. It's frustrating that's the case, but yes, there are positive ways of mobilizing around that. The unions question. There's a couple of things in there. One is, as I think a couple of people have already noted in the comments thread, that's kind of already happening. And I think this is one of the reasons why the unions are scared. This idea that there could be a power base outside the official labour force. There's been lots of commentary over decades now that one of the reasons behind the collapse in union membership globally is that people less and less identify with their paid labour. And that is unfortunately actually thanks to the success of the labour movement. The labour movement have successfully, for a large proportion of the population, helped people not have to be defined by what they sell their labour for, to find other meaning in their lives, to find other paths. And as a consequence, the power of organised labour has decreased. That is an irony, but it is true. That's not to say that organised labour doesn't remain a central part of how power works in our society, and I think always will do. And they are also caught up now in the suppression of democracy, the suppression of advocacy, of the criminalisation of protest, all of those kinds of things. The union movement globally just continues to play and is finding really fascinating ways of engaging differently in political processes. The labour movement in the USA, the AFL-CIO, was heavily involved in the organising around the pro-democracy organising in the US in the last couple of months around how do we respond to the expectation that there will be an attempted coup, which there was. So the labour movement, if they're smart, can think of really interesting and creative ways of how they actually shift their organising into a new world. If the labour movement insists on continuing to organise as if the world still is as it was in the 1930s and 40s, they will become irrelevant. Just like any other organising group, you have to move with the times. So I think UBI genuinely will accelerate that process. So there is probably reason why people in the union movement who don't particularly want to change are scared of it. But if they do that, if they fail to change, they will become more irrelevant much faster. And as I said earlier on, I will mourn that. I'm a union member for a long time and a union supporter, a very big believer in the importance of unionism, but they have to change. They have to move with the times.
All right. I think that's where we'll wrap it up for tonight. Thank you, Tim, for attending. Thank you, everyone else, for your questions and for participating. And if you're watching this on the live stream on YouTube, thank you as well for that. Please like and share and subscribe. And we're going to be we do these every month. Last Monday of every month is Fair Go Basic Income Discussion Group, where we Australian supporters of a basic income together to have a chat. We also have Basic Income Australia, which is an action group. Josh, do you want to tell people? Josh is one of the conveners of that. Do you want to quickly plug our Saturday meeting for those who'd like to attend, Josh?
Yeah, so this meeting started at 7:30, so whichever time zone that works out for you. But on Saturday, we've got a meeting at 4 p.m. And if this event runs monthly and it's more for discussion, Saturday runs monthly and it's more for action. So we talk about ways we can push together and find ways to move things forwards to where we want to be.
Okay, great. And people can find that via the Facebook page, can't they?
Yes.
Facebook
I've just posted a link in the chat for people who are here right now, but for people who are watching this later, you can head to basicincomeaustralia.com or basicincome.rocks. Both URLs work.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. We're going to wrap it up there.
Thank you.